Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Red Grace Live. My name is Emilio Ramos. As always, I am joined by Michael Whitehead. And today on the program, we are discussing some very, very important subjects and tackling the theology of John Owen, which is always fun, always challenging. John Owen, obviously, if you are familiar with John Owen's theology, his writings, John Owen is a monster theologian, and his writings can be very, very challenging and detailed. But at the same time, John Owen has been one of the most encouraging of all the Puritans, the prince of the Puritans, really. And so everything that John Owen says, tends to be very deep and profound. Don't always agree with John Owen, even as we're going to see today. We're not going to agree with John Owen on everything, but always has something very good to teach us. But before we get into all of that content, Micah, how are you? And what do you think of what do you think of these fires in Maui?
First off, I'm doing great.
That's random, right? I went
No,
from how are you to fires in Maui, but
yeah, I mean, and you've broken my heart. My wife and I have a true love for the island of Maui, and we honeymooned there. We vacation there on the regular, and Lahaina is just one of
mm,
those cities that we've spent a decent amount of time in. And so it's the human tragedy is probably the thing that I struggle with the most in this whole thing. The I think we're almost about to hit 100 deaths so far that they found.
unbelievable.
The just sheer loss of property, and then on top of that, the anger that I feel whenever we have our federal government and our president responding with just here's a few little dollars to keep you happy, and what meanwhile they're spending or sending billions and billions of dollars over to a war that has no impact on us. So I just kind of stuck my foot in it right there. Emilio, how do you feel about the fires in Maui?
I saw a home video of somebody with their cell phone
Hmm.
that started recording the whole timeline of what they saw.
Wow.
And they actually saw the fire just initially starting, and they were looking out the window, probably like all of us would. And they're just sitting there going, wow, look at that. And then eventually that turned into, wow, we got to get out of here.
Yeah.
And this family was actually literally recorded everything all the way to the point where they're sitting on a freeway overpass miles and miles away from the town and filming the town at a distance now
Mhm.
and literally just watching it burn. And I think
Wow.
one of the reasons that made that fire so deadly was, you know, um, they were having like hurricane winds. I mean, they were having like
Right.
80-mile-an-hour winds,
Right.
and it's just insane. It just made the fire and the capacity of that fire to explode. It still blows my mind, Micah. It boggles my mind how a fire can get so out of control that, I mean, it's one thing if you say the hillside is on fire.
Hmm.
It's another thing like the entire town burned down, the cars, I
Right.
mean, everything.
Right.
And you're right, man. I think not to get too political, but why not? When you see that Biden was asked, "What do you think about the victims in Maui?" and he said,
No comment.
"No comment." He
Yeah.
said, "No comment," and smiled and got inside of an SUV. I mean that. I mean, I think even as of right now, okay, he has not yet done any sort of press conference or anything major on it.
No.
It's just staggering, very, very disturbing. And
Yeah,
I
and
mean, isn't that what you think?
they
I
could have
mean, I think
asked.
by now we all expect a press conference or
Yeah,
something.
well, they could have asked his favorite ice cream, and he would have jumped for joy to answer that
Yeah,
question. But
yeah.
you ask him something that has true importance, and his communications team sends out a tweet that basic. Wait, we can't call them tweets anymore. A post or whatever it's supposed to be
That's
now.
right. We were just
Um,
talking about that. They're not tweets anymore.
sends out a post basically saying, "Oh, we're going to send $700," as if $700 is going to cover the cost of a house burned down, a car burned to the ground,
And
Your
relocate your whole family.
your pets, you've lost everything in your that you've tried to attain over a lifetime, and just the horror of it all. And I'll say one more thing. A lot of people get confused about, it's supposed to be paradise. Well, Maui, Western Maui is more of a deserty, more of a drier,
Yeah,
arid, that side of the island. You go to the other side of the island, that's where the road to Hana is, and that's where Haleakala is, and beautiful, beautiful jungle type
yeah,
areas. But the arid nature of the Lahaina area and where that is, it does not shock me that a fire that is fueled by this hurricane that passed close enough where the outer bands and the outer winds were creating some havoc and did this. It doesn't shock me that all the ingredients can come together at one moment and create this kind of natural disaster. It's how do we as a community, as a culture, and as the government, how do we respond to those things? And so far, I've not seen any government, whether it be the local government or federal government, respond well. I think is the right word to use there.
yeah. There certainly hasn't been a show of force. There
Correct.
hasn't been any overwhelming authority that has
Mhm.
come forward and demonstrated some sort of solidarity
Right.
with the community there. And I mean, Micah, you and I were just talking. You know, sadly, that fire is, and the leadership or the lack thereof display that's on display is something of a parable of our nation right now as a whole. And like I told you, brother,
Yeah.
I look out into the future and I don't like what I see. I mean, I think that, like I said, if you're conservative, if you're Republican, and if you're expecting the tide to change in this nation at all, I don't know. I just think, as far as I can tell, you know, I think Trump is the only one that can win from the Republican side of things. But I think with all the legal issues that he's having, I just don't even know if if he'll really be a viable candidate. And if he's not, I mean, I just don't see how that doesn't pave the way for another 4 years of the same kind of lunacy that we've been living under here for a while now, and that's not good, man. Because I think another 4 8 years of this type of administration,
No.
I think our country, and the reason why I would
We're
say
Rome
right
right
now,
now.
maybe more than, yeah, and I think right now one of the reasons why is because what's sort of the big globalist things that are
Mhm.
emerging. Globalism is one of those things. We talked about it in the new apologetics, um, and as one of those things that as Christians and as the church, we have to start addressing now way more self-consciously. Whereas before, when we think of globalism or something, we just think, oh, the UN or the United Nations or something like that.
Yeah.
But it has nothing to do with me. Not anymore.
Right.
And because of the advent now of global currencies and what's going on with the dollar and the BRIC nations and
Mhm.
BRICS nations, and what's happening with that whole thing, it just, you know what, it's difficult for me right now, as far as I can tell, with as much of the things that I have my pulse on, or my hand on the pulse. It's difficult to see going forward how this works out for America. It's just not looking good.
Right. And I'll be honest and say, politics has always kind of been, I've never been a huge sports fan. Politics has always been kind of my sports. And I can probably give you pick up any politician. I can probably tell you their name. Um, but I'm not a Trump guy. I mean, I've never, I haven't voted successfully or for a winner in a presidential race since George W. Bush. So Trump's, I really appreciate where Trump has gone in a lot of this stuff. I, Trump is not my favorite this go round, but what bothers me is that the attacks that the indictments that they're laying out are really malicious and an attack on on conservative values and Christian moral values. Um,
Yeah.
because I lump in specifically, let's talk about the most recent one, the Atlanta, the Fulton County indictment of free speech. Free speech, I believe, is a biblical trait that comes
Principle. Yeah.
principle that comes straight out of the Word of God. And so now they're attacking just the most minute conversations as being just now illegal and against the law, but not for 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, whenever any Democrats said the same thing. And so they're
Yeah.
pushing me into the arms of Trump even harder. And I'm fully convinced that if the election is held and he is behind bars somewhere, he will absolutely win
Hmm.
without
That's
a doubt.
interesting. I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that. It's just, to me, it's, regardless of I guess how it plays out,
Hmm.
it's just when you see the kind of things that are on the horizon and the type of things that certain institutions and global entities want to implement in America, it certainly makes for some pretty daunting times. And
Right.
not unrelated to what we're talking about today, because I mean, we're talking about John Owen eschatology, and
Hmm.
we're talking about Pilgrim theology. And in the midst of our political fervor that we're all living through now,
Hmm.
right? This is actually, I covered this on the new apologetics. At some point, I mentioned this idea that we're all kind of on political overload,
Yeah.
and that all of a sudden it's like we woke up and just everything around us now
Right.
is political, cultural war driven. Things are
Hmm.
heating up for sure. And kind of like now more than ever, what's going to be the Christian worldview that comes back? And yeah, we have precedents, we have biblical precedents for principles and governance and things like that, right?
Hmm.
But even more comprehensively, how do we as Christians hold on to the promises of God in the midst of all of that? So probably we'll get to some of those things, but maybe I'll do the first word and then we'll jump into some of this content. So let's
Sounds
do
good.
that. So John Owen is a very important figure in the history of Reformed theology. Obviously, John Owen, the English Puritan known as the Prince of the Puritans. And one of the reasons why I wanted to cover Owen's theology today was his volume 9 of his works, where he covers an exposition on Second Peter chapter 3 and his interpretation of Peter's words there. Uh, Postmillennialism and theonomy is something we recently covered and we've covered a number of times. But if you've interacted with anybody coming from that perspective of eschatology, post-mill, theonomy, reconstructionism, what have you, you will know that when it comes to the passage out of Second Peter chapter 3, let's say, for example, where Peter talks about the fact that the elements will dissolve and the heavenly bodies will melt away, and the works of the earth will be burnt up, and those kinds of things, and that we look for a new heavens and a new earth where righteousness dwells. If you have taken that passage to speak of eschatology proper, meaning that Peter is talking about the end of the world, well, John Owen has a different interpretation. And for me, if you've had any sort of conversations with post-mill theology brethren, you'll know that this volume that or this sermon actually that Owen has written on the exposition of this passage is their kind of default go-to exposition that they'll point you to and tell you to go there if you want a proper interpretation of that passage. And so I think it's important for us to interact with it, to talk about it, and also to understand that there are a lot of hermeneutical issues involved. And I think it's important for us to read John Owen in context. And so we'll actually look at some of the quotes that I dug up from Owen on these works, and talk about kind of the line of argumentation that he gives out of Second Peter. And I think it's important for us to do that because Owen is not just giving us exegesis and exposition, he's also giving us theology. So we have to ask the question, what is the proper synthesis of theology when you're looking at the fact that John Owen talks about essentially a postmillennial interpretation out of Second Peter, but then also simultaneously out of the letters of Peter, and especially his famous 7-volume commentary on Hebrews, where John Owen argues very strongly for a pilgrim theology. And how do you synthesize those things together in your theology? That becomes really, really important. And so this is going to be kind of a 10,000-foot view of John Owen. We can get really, really deep and detailed into what Owen has given us here, but I think it's important for us to not lose the forest for the tree, so to speak, and try to grasp what he is saying ultimately and how that compares to what he says elsewhere, uh, especially in Hebrew. So we'll look at all of those points coming together, and hopefully we can give people a response to, well, we've gone to Second Peter, we've looked at that, but Second Peter and John Owen can't be the ultimate authority on that issue because there's so much more to be said. So with that, we'll jump into the nuts and bolts of all of this and discuss the importance of John Owen and Second Peter.
Well,
A lot of theology, Micah, a lot of theology.
So help me out with this. I've heard that all the postmill guys, we're kind of kicking the ant pile again with this. And I've always kind of heard that, a lot of the Puritans and a lot of the reformers might have been kind of in the postmill camp, but they were not theonomists. What was kind of Owen's view about theonomy? Is he in that camp, and can you be postmill and not a theonomist?
Oh, sure. Well, the answer to the last question there is yes. You can be postmillennial and not be theonomist, and I believe that is where John Owen was. I don't think. First of all, let's get our historical theology correct, right?
Okay.
John Owen wouldn't know what theonomy is if you smacked him in the face with it. That's an anachronistic error. If people think, and not that you were, but if people think, right, that we can just take theonomy and apply it to John Owen, okay? I mean, John Owen wouldn't even know what that is. You'd have to explain your theology to him, and he would have an entire interpretive grid on how to achieve that. I would actually argue, based on what we're going to talk about a little bit today, that John Owen actually is not a theonomist. I don't think he sort of fits the bill of theonomy, and even a certain postmillennialism of today. I'm not so sure that John Owen is even arguing for that of what we find today. So what we find today is basically, Micah, that people are arguing from a postmillennial theology that eventually we will Christianize this world, okay?
Right.
And the reason why is because Psalm 110, Psalm 2, and other places promise the victory of the Messiah over all of his enemies, and he will put all his enemies under his feet. And that somehow means that in a geophysical fashion, in this age, in this world, before he returns, the church is actually going to accomplish this through the preaching of the gospel mainly, but not solely, because it's not, for theonomy and postmillennialism, it's not just about preaching the gospel, it's also about cultural change and how that we can transform the culture around us through the preaching of the gospel, absolutely, but cultural engagement. And so that takes on a much more reconstructionist concept. And although I believe John Owen would be absolutely all for changing the culture for Christ or affecting the culture for Christ, I think we'll see in a little bit here that John Owen actually did not expect for there to ever be a Christian culture, strictly speaking. Certainly not in the Christian Reconstructionist sense of the word today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So, because I know that Edwards is probably in that same camp as well of not fully understanding what these things are. But so, like, I'm interested to hear all the points that you're about to argue from what he has written and such. So let's just dive into some of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, John Owen is a monster theologian, and in his sermon on Second Peter, he argues for a partial preterist interpretation. No surprise there. He only cites or references Matthew 24. His focus is mainly dealing with Second Peter and how Second Peter relates to Old Testament passages like Isaiah 65, Isaiah 66, and other places. And so what Peter is basically saying is, or excuse me, what Owen is saying is that in the letter of Second Peter, Peter is arguing for the removal of the Jewish state, and that is the doing away of the old heavens and the old earth, and that what he calls actually the Judaical church. Okay, he uses the word church. This is kind of like Full Metal covenantalism. Okay, sorry, that would make a dispensationalist heart skip, by the way. But anyway, he calls it the Judaical church, and that the dissolving of the heavens and the burning of the luminaries and the works of the earth being burnt up is all about the removal of the world system of ancient Israel. And when did that happen? Well, obviously that happened through the establishment of a new covenant. That happened through the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Okay. And so he points out that, in other places in the Old Testament, you can have this apocalyptic language, but there is no actual cosmic apocalyptic, in a sense, upheaval. So you can talk about the heavens melting away, but they don't actually melt physically. It's metaphorical, in other words, of a time. And so this is what John Owen calls alterations and destructions or disillusions. And so for him, we're looking at an alteration, not in creation, going from this creation to the next creation, but he is seeing that this is actually an alteration in times. And that whatever new heaven and new earth Peter was talking about in the letter of Peter, he was only talking about what John Owen calls gospel times. But here's the deal. When you think about what Owen is arguing, a lot of times people will latch onto this preterist interpretation. Oh, look, John Owen is talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and that is what we're talking about in terms of the day of the Lord and the judgment day and those kinds of things. And so if we're constantly having a future hermeneutic, a futurist hermeneutic, right, then John Owen is going to be disagreeing with that. And he's showing you a way in which actually all of this eschatology can refer back to a preterist fulfillment, a preterist interpretation. So, but here's what happens with that interpretation, Micah. John Owen does not just see the destruction of the temple as the fulfillment of the things that Peter is talking about, but that Peter, in this idea of alterations and destructions or disillusions, Peter is saying that these are judgment events that happen all the time. Well, maybe not all the time, but it's certain like serious historical moments. Whenever God, let's say, topples a regime or he does away with a certain evil nation, let's say in some of the Crusades, when the Muslims were stopped from invading, Jerusalem or something like that, then he would see that as an example of God intervening in the world in judgment for certain reasons. And so no doubt, John Owen would argue that something like Nazi Germany was a judgment of God where Jesus judged the world and he produced he produced two things. So why is Owen talking about this? What Owen is saying is really what he's latching onto is 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 11, when Peter says, since all these things are going to be destroyed in this way, what sort of people ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness. That's actually Owen's burden. So his burden is to say, when acts of judgment come, the reason they come is so that there will be a sort of a heightened awareness of godliness and a pursuit of holiness.
Mhm.
And so John Owen is basically saying, when you see stuff like communist Russia falling, let's say the old Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, or when you see things like, okay, let's say something like Al Qaeda or ISIS being destroyed, right? This is the judgment of God coming in the world, so that you and I will have a greater alertness spiritually, so that we will have an incentive to pursue holiness. And in that sense, John Owen is arguing that these kind of historical events, when they happen, these are comings of Christ. These are like small sort of instances of second coming events, small judgment days that have occurred in the world in order to strike fear in the wicked and in order to produce holiness in the righteous. That's the way that John Owen talks about it. And what we're talking about, and I actually have the book here, but it's going to be in volume 9 of John Owen, and it's going to be sermon 10. And it's going to be sermon 10, but I also want to talk about sermon 11. But in sermon 10, he's arguing for an argument of what he says, an argument for universal holiness. And that's what I'm talking about. And that he expects there to be, from these upheavals, these cultural, historical upheavals, beginning, let's say, with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, what Peter is talking about, that future judgments like that should cause people to be gripped with the fear of God, and all kinds of good things come out of these cataclysmic events. Now that's that's John Owen's take on Peter's reasoning. And I got to tell you guys, this is part of why I've argued now for some time, Micah, that Reformed people need to come to grips with something that goes all the way back to the Reformation, Calvin, the Puritans, going up to Edwards, leading up to, let's say, the middle of the 19th century, where we see that we have, as a church, we've come quite a long way exegetically. Okay, if you're not willing to admit that to yourself, you're emotional or sentimental. The Puritans, some of the older exegetes and theologians, they are unmatched in their intellect. They are unmatched in their critical thinking, and sometimes regarding some issues, there is no one better. For example, James Buchanan on the doctrine of justification. People would say, well, that's an older work. That was done, over 100 years ago now. And so that's kind of dated. Yeah, but James Buchanan's work is unmatched in its penetrating statements about justification. It is just so healthy, so sound, so right, so accurate, so orthodox and biblical, that we need to always pay respect to people like James Buchanan and others, because at times they just nail it on the head. I would say the same thing with John Owen when it comes to a book that he wrote, or the work that he did called "The Death of Death in the Death of Christ" on the atonement. And that book actually moved me along in my Reformed journey to embrace the doctrine of limited atonement, for example. And to this day, no one has even come close to refuting, I don't believe, what John Owen did there. But we just have to, we need a shot of realism, right? That they didn't get everything right. They didn't, let's say, have certain aspects of their theology developed. And I would say eschatology is one of those main things, specifically like the Puritans, that we have come a long way exegetically and grammatically and and just in our ability to do intertextual work in the Bible.
Right.
I just think that we have come such a long way. We just have to acknowledge that. So I don't know
Yeah,
if
well, I
that
mean,
makes sense.
well, Emilio, think about it from kind of the vantage point of, or most of you probably don't know. I've been in Emilio's home and in his office, and it he's got so many books that he can't contain them in one room. Kind of an approach, and so like the reformers, Calvin and Luther and Owen and Edwards and all these guys, they
Yeah.
didn't have all those books that you're talking about that you reference
Yeah.
on a daily basis to get to where you are today. Just the few books behind me on my bookshelf. These guys were
Yeah.
critical thinkers and were able to allow the Holy Spirit to unlock. Want to be careful there to open their eyes to what the Bible is actually saying in some of these instances, and reading through Second Peter or Hebrews and all this kind of stuff. So like we got to take it from the vantage point of, well, yeah, maybe they're not going to get everything right. This is kind of one of the arguments I have for the KJV only guys. It's like, well, of course our textual criticism is going to advance from the 1500s or whenever the authorized version was set. So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we can always look back and criticize some of their work, but we have to give them a huge amount of credit for where they came from. Whereas now today with technology and where things are going, we're able to cross-reference so much stuff. I mean, you and I both have copies of Logos, and we're able to
Mm.
just pull up almost any reference that we can think of just at the blink of an eye. And
Correct.
these guys weren't able to do that. They had to write the references themselves and figure it out and do the hard work of, oh yeah, that moves to over here. So like,
Yeah.
with as brilliant as he was and some of the things that he got right, how could he be so wrong on some of these issues? Like I would consider what was the word that you used about his view on Israel?
The Judaical Church.
I mean, that even as coming from an mill kind of a positional stance on where, we get accused of replacement theology all the time, that seems like even pushing the bar for me at least. So like,
Well, yeah.
how can he get things so wrong?
Well, he doesn't get everything wrong, and that's what makes
Sure.
reading somebody like John Owen complicated. Is
Mhm.
that at times, even in the context of passages and paragraphs where I would disagree with him,
Mhm.
there are some instances that he obviously, he's not getting everything wrong. To me, a lot of it he gets really right.
Right.
And so that makes sifting through the work of someone like Owen or another Puritan, whether it be Watson or whether it is, John Flavel. I mean, one of my personal favorite Puritans is John Flavel, the fountain of life in Christ. I mean, that's some of the Puritan theology par excellence. So it makes it difficult to untangle where at times they get things really really right, even but in the next sentence they get things really really wrong.
Right.
And I think a lot
Yeah.
of that has to do, Micah, with exegesis and with hermeneutics.
Mhm.
And for Owen, maybe it would help us to understand what is the basis for which Owen interprets this theology in this way,
Right.
right? For John Owen, he is looking at Second Peter, and what he's arguing is that Second Peter is basically expounding Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66, where in Isaiah 66, he is arguing that Isaiah does not have a full or consummate eschatology in view, because it seems like even in Isaiah's mind, it was this earthly ministry that was going to come forth out of the new heavens and the new earth. And I think what Owen was really lacking, Micah, as we think about where he went wrong, is I think in hermeneutics we have developed something today in Reformed theology that we call redemptive historical hermeneutics.
Mhm.
And though we get it from people like Calvin and Owen and certain Puritans and then others, where they manifest and they show elements of redemptive historical hermeneutics, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think that that is what's happening, because what is missing from John Owen's exposition and connection of these passages of Scripture is a category of eschatology that we call semi-realized eschatology. Now, we did the episode with Lane Tipton, and you were a fly on the wall. And as you like to say, when he and I get together, you usually go to sleep.
Screensaver mode goes on, and I just kind of go blank.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But if people will go back to that episode with Dr. Tipton, and they listen very carefully to what Lane is doing there out of Hebrews chapter 2, Owen is connecting not only the Isaiah passages to Peter, to 2 Peter, but he's also saying that Hebrews chapter 12, verses 26 to 28 are doing the same thing that Peter is doing in terms of, look, this is eschatological language of the shaking of the heavens and earth. And what Hebrews is talking about is not the end of the world. What Hebrews is talking about is obviously the arrival of a new covenant and the doing away of an old covenant. So that shows you. But it's funny to me that as he quotes Hebrews 12, beginning in 26 and going to 28, he doesn't quote verse 25. And that's important because verse 25 is the connection back to chapter 2 of Hebrews. So Hebrews 12, 25, Hebrews 2, verses 1 through 4, but especially verse 2 and 3, where we are told that we will not escape if we neglect so great a salvation. And that is obviously in the future tense of escaping, okay? And the author of Hebrews repeats it again in chapter 12. And what we were talking about with the Lane Tipton episode is that is an instance of semi-realized eschatology, where, in a sense, we are not waiting for more of the same judgments from the law. We're waiting for the final judgment at the end of time, and that final judgment has actually broken into this time through Jesus Christ at the cross, where he bore the wrath of the final judgment, the final wrath of God. All right. And it's that semi-realized eschatology that is missing, that helps us to understand, no, look, the reason why the author of Hebrews and Peter are using this eschatological language is because that eschatological consummate reality pertains to this life right now. And if we neglect the salvation that God has revealed, we are assured that end time destruction. And so I think there's more to it than simply saying, look, the new covenant has come, the old covenant passed away, and there you have the old heavens and the old earth, and the new heavens and the new earth. We know that Scripture does not teach that. We know that the new heavens and the new earth have a consummate fulfillment. And so, and how do we know that for sure? Well, because Revelation chapter 21 says so. And everybody agrees, post-millennialists included, that Revelation 21 is talking about the new creation proper. Not talking about it's not talking about an initial inaugurated installment. It's not talking about already not yet. Revelation 21 verses 1 through 4 is talking about consummation. We are, in a sense, we are in heaven by then. We are in the new creation by then. And therefore, we know that Scripture, when it speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, whatever realized eschatology is going on, does not preclude that there is a consummate eschatology, an absolute fulfillment of the absolute end. And I think that becomes very, very important. But, I think does that make sense, Micah? I just want to make sure that You're probably not tracking with everything I just said there because I said a boatload, but just the idea that when we're talking about new heavens and new earth, it may have an initial fulfillment, but that does not preclude the idea that that is going to be fulfilled in a consummate way at the absolute end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to just be, completely transparent here and say that, you know, Emilio and I are kind of still working through undoing a lot of my dispensational theology from, 30 years of, being
Yeah.
in growing up in a charismatic home and then going into an SBC that is staunchly dispensational. And then working my way into more of a reformed faith. So, like, everything that you're saying, Emilio, like, it makes
Yeah.
sense, but I'm always having to, view it through the lens of, well, does this before the church is raptured, after the church is raptured? Is are the helicopters from Desert Storm, are those the locusts that John saw coming up over the hill or whatever it was?
Right, right.
So yeah, so I hear you. I understand a
I
lot of
understand.
what you're saying, but I'm
Yeah.
sitting here thinking through, and I think a lot of people, maybe not the good old Presbyterians, with superior theology, would say that, but for some of us, it's like it's still unlearning a lot and learning new. So, um,
For sure.
but I hear you.
No,
I'm
for
I'm
sure.
I'm I'm tracking with you, but I'm trying to reconcile it with some and unlearning some other things.
Well, if you have a dispensational premillennial position,
Hmm.
then the problem there is the same problem as postmillennialism. You don't have a category of semi-realized eschatology.
Right.
And so now you're going to get in trouble when scripture does talk about the day of the Lord in a past tense event. Let's say, for example, at Pentecost. How
Yeah.
is Pentecost the fulfillment of the day of the Lord if, according to dispensationalism, the day of the Lord is strictly future? And so now you have that problem. So the answer, of course, I believe, is semi-realized eschatology.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, what's funny, Micah, is that I think actually John Owen is going to argue the very same thing, maybe unwittingly or not piecing all the parts together. But I think he actually ends up arguing that exact thing. And we're going to show some quotes. We're going to show a quote of John Owen here in a moment. But when you look at Peter, I would take this to be much more of an eschatological passage because there's a correlation in Jude with Peter that's very important that actually John Owen himself is going to point out, which I thought was just kind of funny. But if you even look at the context of 2 Peter chapter 3, we are told explicitly that this whole context, this whole chapter is framed around truly eschatological categories of the second coming. And Peter is talking about the arrival of the day of God. That's in verse 12. He's talking about the day of the Lord, verse 10. He's talking about the promise of his coming, which is in verse 4 and in verse 9. And so, again, we are not dealing simply with a historical event that happened at the destruction of the temple. If that's the case, I don't think the context of 2 Peter makes any sense. Let me give you an example. If you go after this whole section, Micah, for people that are following along, even in their Bibles, if you go after this section in verse 14, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 14, right? This tends to not make a whole lot of sense if John Owen is correct that all we're talking about here, according to him, is, quote, gospel times, because we're talking about the civil and the state, according to him. Because here, Peter goes on to say, therefore, kind of like as the conclusion of this, beloved, since you look for these things, watch this now, be diligent to be found by him in peace, spotless and blameless. Whoa. So if this was not an actual coming of the Lord to his people, why do we need to be prepared to be found by him? That doesn't make any sense. And so it must be that Peter is thinking cosmically and consummately, however much he may have inaugural, semi-realized eschatology in his mind. No doubt, Peter is still thinking of the ultimate day of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And what's really crazy, again, is that I think John Owen actually would agree with that, because no one rejects that, historical events in the Old Testament are cast in the language of apocalyptic images and imagery. But Owen and the post-mill position, I think, they seem at times incapable of grasping the notion of inaugurated, semi-realized eschatology, where the day of the Lord is both, can have sort of a both and, right? There could be present fulfillment, like we said at Pentecost, but it's also that consummate fulfillment at the second coming of Jesus Christ, or eschatology proper. I think that is super, super important. And the reason I say let's get into some of the inconsistencies of John Owen, and how postmillennialists, when they direct you to John Owen, they often don't direct you to the idea that for however much postmillennialism John Owen had, what's interesting, Micah? In the very same volume that they point you to, John Owen believes in a cataclysmic judgment to come. He believes in the Antichrist, which today's postmillennial guys do not. Right. They believe that the Antichrist came and went. That was again, that's in 70 AD. That's those are the emperors. That's whether it was Nero or Titus or Vespasian, or all three that make up sort of an Antichrist 666 in their mind. John Owen believes Antichrist is yet future, and even had some fulfillment in the papacy. And so that right there is something you got to really reckon with and reconcile that. He also believes in ongoing persecution and apostasy right now in this church age after 70 AD. Again, if he is saying that there is still a future judgment, a future Antichrist, a future persecution and falling away, you're basically saying what futurist eschatology says. You're saying what amillennialism would say. You're even saying what premillennialism would say at that point. So it's very, very important to understand the importance, again, of a redemptive historical interpretation. As a matter of fact, Micah, maybe you can pull up that quote from volume 9. The big quote. I gave Micah this big quote because I think it's important for us to read that in this quote right here, John Owen is actually going to make what I would call a very clear, redemptive, historical argument. And notice what sermon it is. What sermon is that, Micah?
Sermon 11. Or XI.
Chi.
Twitter number 1.
That's right. Twitter number 1. Yeah. And in other words, this comes right after Sermon 10, which is the sermon on 2 Peter chapter 3. So the very next sermon, which continues his point on this idea of universal holiness and why we need to pursue universal holiness, look at what John Owen says. He says, every such day is a lesser day of judgment, a forerunner, pledge, and evidence of the great day of the Lord, which is to come. God's great and signal judgments in the world are to be looked on as pledges of the final judgment at the last day. And then he's going to quote Jude verse 7. He says, so Jude tells us that in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, here's redemptive historical hermeneutics right here, brother. God set forth an example of them that shall suffer. I think there's a typo there, sorry.
Yeah.
That shall suffer the vengeance of eternal fire. And so, whether willingly or unwillingly, maybe just leave that quote up there for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It does look kind of funny. She'll suffer. But we know what it says. But think about it. Whether he knew this or not, John Owen is essentially articulating a redemptive historical approach as he uses their Jude. And I would say whatever elements of preterism Owen had in Matthew 24, in 2 Peter chapter 3, or in Revelation, he still believes that these signals of judgment are pledges of a future antichrist, a future tribulation, a future day of judgment, future persecution. And that's what postmillennial theology desperately needs, because I think that's what it leads people to confusion as they encounter the postmillennial hermeneutic. Then they're left and struck with a sense of, but wait a minute, there's so much in the Bible that seems future. Mm-hmm. And it is. And so redemptive historical hermeneutics is going to help you to see that historical fulfillments in the past, like John Owen says, these are mere pledges and forerunners of the end. And guess who else believed that, Micah? John Calvin believed that. Mm-hmm. John Calvin says about the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 that generation, right, and the tribulation of those days, what was that? That was all, according to him, the very same things that the saints at the end of time are going to face. And he had that same sort of redemptive, historical anticipation. And that, that hermeneutical issue right there, man, is really important. Now, for John Owen, as he is thinking about 2 Peter, Jude, and even the book of Hebrews, the reason I wanted to talk about John Owen eschatology and Pilgrim theology is because one of the things that postmillennial guys today are very hostile to is Pilgrim theology. And why do you think that is, Micah?
Just because they're hostile to everything that actually makes sense? I actually don't know. Sorry, there could have actually just been a spit take there. Sorry for taking that.
Actually, Micah, let's. I want you to look down because I sent you some comments on that, on that point right there. Right, postmillennialism and John Owen's Pilgrim theology. That there are some issues revolving around this whole idea of Pilgrim theology and why they have problems with it. Mm-hmm. It's too abstract. It's too pessimistic.
Yeah.
It's pietistic. All you care about is your own personal, private piety. It's not practical enough. It doesn't engage in the culture. It doesn't believe in the lordship of Jesus Christ over every realm, including politics, right? These are the things that you're going to hear from people when you're talking about Pilgrim theology, and they reject it for a postmillennial position. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why I thought it would be good for us to go to stay with John Owen, but go to his exposition of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14. Matter of fact, why don't I go ahead and read that verse real quick?
Okay.
This is Hebrews 13, 14. He says, "For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come." Now, it's a short verse, but it comes on the heels of having just been told that as Christians, we need to be willing to go and bear the reproach of Jesus. And we are called to do what? Go outside the gate, go outside the camp and suffer with him. What's the gate? What's the camp in Hebrews? Well, it no longer is talking about the boundaries of Israel. It is now talking about outside of this world, outside of this world system. We need to be able to go outside, basically, of the city of man and willing to suffer crucifixion. In other words, identify with the sufferings of Jesus. So let's start working through, because on this passage right here, John Owen makes several observations, and they are all leading you to a robust pilgrim theology. And so let's start with the first, like, these observations are in a sequence. So it starts with observation 5, okay? Because this has to do with what he's been expositing in Hebrews. But this is him commenting on Hebrews 13:14. Now look at what he says first. He says, believers are not likely to meet with any such encouraging entertainment in this world as to make them unready or unwilling to desert it. Now, I don't know about you, Micah, but you start telling post-mill guys to desert this world.
Yeah.
And they have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
Right? He says here, and to, yeah, go ahead.
They've got to go to their school board meetings. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, is that what they're saying is, if we're going to redeem the world, if we're going to cultivate the world, if we're going to repristinate this culture, how could we possibly go around telling people to desert it?
Right.
I don't know. John Owen, the post-millennialist, John Owen said to do that. He says, and to go forth after Christ, bearing his reproach. Yeah. He says, for it is a motive in the apostles' reasoning unto a readiness to that duty. We have here no continuing city. And so for John Owen, this is not abstract. This is not pietistic. This is not just theoretical. This is the foundation of our engagement with this world. For John Owen, he saw it as a duty for the Christian to be ready to think like this. And I think it's remarkable. Now, if you go to the next observation, he makes a statement that makes no sense to a post-millennialist today. Micah, can you read that?
This world never did, nor ever will, give a state of rest and satisfaction to believers, unto believers. It will not afford them a city. It is Jerusalem above, and that is the vision of peace. Arise and depart. This is not your rest.
Yeah. Well, that's
not what we're hearing out of most of these guys, which are, we've got to make everything better so that we can prepare the way of the coming kingdom of God. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Not only that, Micah.
This.
Yeah, not only that, Micah, but how does this interpretation by John Owen, if you notice, it's comprehensive. Mm-hmm. He didn't leave any stone unturned, in a sense. This world never did, nor ever will,
right,
give a state. He says it will not afford them a city. It is Jerusalem above. That's the vision of peace. Mm-hmm. And we are to arise and depart from this world because this is not our rest. Wow. John Owen is basically saying there never has been a Christian nation. Truly, truly, truly. There never will be a Christian nation. Yeah. And though postmillennialists want you to go to John Owen to substantiate your postmillennialism, I don't know that they want to reckon with his exposition in Hebrews here, because John Owen is saying that not only will we not Christianize the nations to the extent that theonomists are saying and postmillennialists are saying and reconstructionists are saying, we can't even look for a city here. There will never be a place that will give rest to us. We'll never, what he's basically saying is we'll never be at home. And the other thing, Micah, is that for people that really want to look into this, go to chapter 11 in his commentary and go to the passages on verses 13 to 16 on Pilgrim Theology.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, I mean, there you have even deeper, comprehensive exegesis of Pilgrim Theology by John Owen, the postmillennialist. So
Yeah.
let's go to the next observation, because he just keeps going here. He says, in the destitution of a present satisfactory rest, meaning we're deprived of it, God has not left believers without a prospect of that which shall be so unto eternity. We have not, but we seek.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of typical Puritan speak, okay? It's kind of, I don't know that we talk like this anymore,
No.
but this is the way that they used to talk, okay? And it's got its own charm and its own beauty. But what John Owen is basically saying is, even though we are deprived right now of a city to call our own in this world, we're not promised that, but we're not left without a prospect of something. And
Right.
what is that prospect? That prospect is that even though we don't possess anything right now, that doesn't mean we don't seek after it. What is that language right there? That is the language of faith. That is the language of Hebrews 11, verse 16, where it says, right, that we are to look unto the city that God has prepared for us. And this is no different than what amillennialism teaches, that this is the great amillennialist hope of Gerhardus Voss, Meredith Kline, Herman Bavinck, Cornelius Van Til, Richard Gaffin, and many, many, many other amillennialist theologians. And so right there, because you start talking like this, Micah, oh, it's your hope. Oh, just put your faith in the city to come. Just look to the heavenly Jerusalem. And postmillennial brethren, they're just completely unsatisfied with that attitude.
Yeah. One of the things that I think you're saying that we don't speak like this anymore. I think the modern day poet or such would say, I still haven't found what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's right. That's good.
God
It's
bless
a little
Bono.
corny, but
God bless
it's corny, but we'll
Bono.
go with it.
Yes.
Let's go to the next observation, number 8. He says here, as God has prepared a city of rest for us, so it is our duty continually to endeavor the attainment of it in the ways of his appointment. And so what he's saying is that this city is what we are now striving for in the ways that God has ordained for us, in the ways that he has appointed.
Mm-hmm.
It is our duty continually to look after these things, to pursue after these things. And basically, man, again, this is just calling us back to the life of faith, to walk by faith, not by sight, to set in front of us this eschatological goal of the heavenly Jerusalem, which is the same faith that Abraham had, patriarchs had, the same faith that the author of Hebrews, that the apostles, and that Jesus have. And so it's very simple, but it's very profound. And one last observation 9. He says the main business of believers in this world is diligently to seek after the city of God, or the attainment of eternal rest with him. And this is the character whereby they may be known. Wow. Leave that one up for a moment.
Okay.
Micah, what is the character whereby we may now be known? It is not cultural engagement, activism, political revolution, social justice. It is not humanitarianism. It is not engaging the arts, aesthetics in this world. It's not sports, industry, innovation, technology. We are to be characterized in this world, known in this world, by our otherworldly pursuit of the city of God. I love John Owen. He's post-millennial, but the Pilgrim theology that he gives us is spectacular.
Yeah. No, and just think about it from the vantage point of the American pilgrims who were kind of ostracized and pushed out of their own communities because of this mindset, because this is the way that they lived. And even, I don't know, I've just been on this word as a kick, but Puritan was a word that was a pejorative kind of in that day to them. So, I mean, this is they truly believed this. They truly lived this out. And I would say the current American church has shifted so far away from this mindset where we're constantly thinking about and meditating on the coming city of God and our eternal state rather than our what's our summer movie popcorn sermon series going to be? How can we make Back to the Future Christian for our congregation?
Mm.
What stupidity, what idiocy are we living in where that makes any hill of beans compared to the eternal city of God and what will happen whenever we are with the Father, with the Trinity in the eternal city of God in the future.
Amen, brother. And I've often said these are observations that John Owen is making to the in his commentary on Hebrews. It's not difficult to know that Hebrews is written to a persecuted people. Just read chapter 10.
Mm-hmm.
And what does the author of Hebrews offer persecuted people? Not a shred of politics. He didn't utter a word about legislation. He didn't mention a single politician or law. Mm-hmm. He mentioned nothing of the sort. He merely pointed them to the inheritance that was set before them, and reminded them that the way they were to live is to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of their faith, and to run the race with endurance. Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, ironically, Micah, in this very same sermon, John Owen warns against peacetime. And he talks about the dangers of social peacetime. When people are at rest, people are dwelling safely and securely, because he says it never produces anything good spiritually. It produces carnality. It produces more spiritual laziness. And it's really remarkable, but it's lockstep with the prophets of old that constantly try to wake the people up out of their slumber, even at peacetime. You remember the fact that Zechariah was given a vision of the angels that went out patrolling the earth, and they came back to report what they had found, and they said, "Behold, the world is at rest, is at ease, is at peace, is quiet and at ease." And then it says that God was angry about that. Because he didn't like that the world was in a state of ease and peace when there are all of these sinful things going on in the world. And the Pilgrim theology, man, I'm telling you, is more than just sit back and just let the world do what it's going to do. No, we engage the culture, but we engage the culture with a transcendent hope, with a transcendent worldview, with a heavenly mindset, and with a revelatory worldview that makes no sense to this world. The Reform Forum guys were in town here recently, Micah, right, a couple weeks ago, and I had a chance to sit down and talk with a couple of the guys. And Camden Busey said something that I thought was really insightful. Camden said that that as soon as the church starts talking in the ways in which make sense to the culture, whether it's politically, culturally, or what have you, usually that's bad.
Yeah.
Because the culture and the world system in which we're living in should not make sense to them at all, because they cannot relate with righteousness, holiness, worship of the triune God. They can't relate with the lordship of Jesus Christ. It makes no sense to them.
Right.
And the Bible is clear. They consider it to be utter folly. And so we should never, in a sense, we should never be relatable to the world at all. And I would venture to say the more consistently Christian we are, the more inconsistent we are to the world. So I just think, this whole line of argument that postmillennialists are using today to talk about John Owen as one of their postmillennial theonomic heroes, I think we need to pump the brakes on that. And I think we need to augment that conversation by saying, wait a second, however postmillennial John Owen was, he was ultimately, and at the end of the day, staunchly rooted in Pilgrim theology.
Well,
and
tell me,
I think that would be very helpful to people.
Yeah, break it down in this fashion, though. Why not let them continue to do that, just pointing to the fact that he had such a high Pilgrim theology in the rest of his writings? Sure, he said this one thing over here that helps prove their point, but they're cherry picking the one thing that they like from him and not considering the rest of everything else that he said.
Well, that's a good point, Micah. And you know what? It just illustrates that I've told people before numerous times that you keep looking backwards to older exegetes regarding eschatology. I can almost promise you're not going to want their exegesis, because, like I said, there's a lot of truth and error mingled into the exegesis of Owen, and at various places, Owen is just he's just too allegorical. He's too hyper spiritual. He's not faithful to the context of certain passages that he's using. The way he tends to proof text, sometimes you're left wondering, and this is kind of consistent with the Puritans. You're left wondering, is that verse really saying what you're saying it says? Like, does that verse really apply to the point you're trying to make? And a lot of times the answer is no. You've kind of ripped that passage out of its context, and it's not really supporting the thing that you're saying. And so I would just say, we can all of us benefit from the Puritans. We can all of us benefit from John Owen, a monster historical theologian in the history of Reformed Orthodoxy. But we need to do it carefully. We need to do it intentionally, and recognize that it's okay for us to say, on a lot of these eschatological passages, we've come a long way. Christian scholarship has made tremendous progress in the area of exegesis and understanding Greek grammar and syntax, and understanding how we bridge the gaps between the testaments and the covenants. And that, thank God that we've made the progress that we've made. And I think we just need to not sort of encapsulate or enshrine any one generation of theologians, but understand that though we stand on the shoulders of giants today, our giants are not perfect. And therefore, even the Reformed slogan, right? Semper Reformanda, we're always reforming. Reformed, but always reforming. And be willing to improve even on somebody as revered as John Owen. I think that as long as we approach it with reverence and with respect, I think that we can all kind of learn from that. So yeah, I just thought this was an important topic to hit. And John Owen, obviously, somebody that I love so much and have learned so much from, but somebody that I think we need to be careful how we engage in his exegesis and theology. So I hope everybody enjoyed that. Hopefully they'll come back to this one, Micah, and kind of use it as a resource and learn from it some more. But Yeah. So
Yeah.
thanks you guys for
Perfect.
watching and joining us for another episode. God bless you guys.
God bless.